So let me. Okay, so so a reminder that this is a joint data release between GoGreen and G-Class. We have to a reasonable extent tried to homogenize the products, which meant manipulating some of the G-Class file formats and catalog formats and things to be consistent with what we've done for GoGreen, so that things are as easy as possible for you to use all the clusters, all the galaxies, spectroscopy, photometry, as one system without worrying about which survey they have come from. There are small differences between the surveys and some things to watch out for, but we have tried to minimize those concerns. So your first stop to find updates and things on this will be our survey page at gogreensurvey.ca, and on there you can find a description of the GoGreen and G-Class first data release and a description of where to find it. Oops. The data are hosted at two places. One is at the CADC on the CanFAR Theospace network. And so this is simply a directory with all the data, the catalogs, the images, and the spectroscopy. And I'll talk briefly about how that's organized. The other place is NSF's NOIR Lab Data Lab product. And this actually just went live today. So if you go to this link here at the datalab.noio.edu link, you will find the access to the GoGreen data. The advantage here, it has both, as you can see along the side menu, the links to the same raw data products that are there on CADC, but there's also an ability to query the catalogs directly, to make image cutouts. For example, if you want to cut out of a cluster member, you can identify that through an SQL-like query and get an image cutout. And you can also run Jupyter notebooks. We have provided Jupyter notebooks for the CADC release as well, but here these notebooks are integrated with the Data Lab infrastructure, so you don't need to download the data yourself. You can run the notebooks and have it access the data at the Data Lab. Okay, so this again was just launched today. I haven't even looked at it to see how it works, but we will be adding functionality to this in the future. So just as a really brief, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but to give you a brief idea of what's here, okay, and we'll look at the CADC data structure. There's a catalogs directory, CATS, okay, that has 3 main files, and for the most part, this is what you're going to be interested in. There's a 26-row file that contains information about each individual cluster in the GoGreen and G-Class system, its position, its velocity dispersion, redshift, and also some pointers to where you can find the associated catalogs. The redshift catalog itself has 2771 rows. Okay, so 1 row for every galaxy with a spectrum. The redshift quality flag tells you whether or not it has a reliable redshift. And then we have information related to each spectrum, including line indices, signal to noise measurements, membership criteria, and things like that. I think that's most of the interesting ones. Okay, so there's 1 entry for every spectroscopic member, for every spectroscopic observation. This is again a merging of G-Class and GoGreen. We only include unique objects, so if there's an object that has a spectrum in both surveys, and there are a few, we only include the GoGreen spectrum. So you don't have to worry about weeding out duplicates. Every line in here is a unique object. We've also provided a file called photo.fits, which is a conservative selection of a K-selected catalog for all our systems. the groups that Andrew was just talking about are selected from the Cosmos and SXDF fields, which have public photometric catalogs out there. And those are what we use. And in fact, the entirety of those, of the entries in those catalogs, so the rows from those catalogs are included in this photo.fits file as well. So you'll find one entry for every object in UltraVista and SXDF, as well as our own Go Green observations. There are things like rest frame colors, stellar masses, fluxes and the various filters, and also a link to whether or not a spectrum exists for that galaxy and what its redshift is. I say this is a conservative subset because we're only including things in here that have a reliable detection in all of the filters. Sorry, we're only including things that have data in all of the filters available for that cluster. So for example, our IRAC imaging for many of our clusters is over a smaller field than much of the data. And so what goes into this catalog is only the stuff that has IRAC detections, sorry, IRAC data, as well as data in all the other filters. That's to say that there is more information in the parent catalogs that were used to generate this file. But this gives you a photometric file linked to the spectroscopy for most purposes. Oops, right. So there is also, sorry, I just got a bit. In the spectroscopy directory, of course, you can access the 1D and the 2D spectra. The 1D spectra are flux calibrated both in a relative sense and absolute. The absolute flux calibration is done relative to the I-band imaging. That's not available for all spectra, so you have to pay attention to the header keyword to know whether or not that's been applied. And the 2D spectra we only have available for Go Green, not for G-class in this release, of course. The photometry directory is a little more complicated, but you will find a directory with the images in all filters for all systems, including HST. There's a directory with the primary catalogs, K-selected catalogs, a directory for photometric redshifts, including full probability distributions, fast outputs for template fits, stellar masses, and rest frame colors. And each of these have different files. They're all row matched. Do look at the README files. There's a slightly different README file for the G-class data that describes the difference between the two. The very reason we provide that photo.fits file is because it pulls much of the relevant information from these photometry catalogs into one place. Okay, so for many things, you might not need to go into these other structures. And lastly, we provide a couple of Python 3 Jupyter notebooks. And I'll show an example of those in a moment. One of the notebooks reproduces some of the plots from the data release paper and just provides an example for how to read the catalogs, how to make some figures and use the data. We also provide the script that builds that photo.fits file. This is table 3 in the data release paper. So this is a more involved script, but it describes how it pulls the data from those various photometry directories to build this parent table. So again, this is useful if you want to add additional information in there that is in the parent catalogs, but that we didn't copy over. Or if you want to modify the selection. So for example, if you don't care about IRAC data, you can have a much larger photometric sample of galaxies. And just understanding how to find what you need from the photometry catalogs, this could be a useful script. So what I'm going to do now is just show you an example of the notebook. Right. Let's No, that's not the right one. Here it is, sorry. Okay, I'm a little bit confused about what you see. Can you confirm that you're seeing a Firefox page with the Jupyter Notebook?
Yep,
Yes.
it looks good.
Yep, great. So again, this is, in order to run this, you download the data from the CCADC and this notebook, and then you should be able to run this notebook on your own machine. Alternatively, these same notebooks are imported into the NOAO data lab, and you can run them there without accessing the data. So there's some documentation and things. The first things we do are to read in each table, and so you see a description here. So we've read in the cluster table here, and so this shows you the basic columns we have and an entry for each cluster. And then there's this photo.fits file and the Redshift catalog. So just downloading those and reading in those three catalogs gives you catalog level data for which you can do lots of things. Making plots like this, cluster velocity dispersion versus Redshift, okay, with just a simple Python code that we provided here that reads in the relative data from those catalog and plots them up. So nothing very fancy. Okay, so just go through most of the plots that are in the data release paper are reproduced here in this notebook. So it's just there for you to get a sense of how to use those data and present them. I'll show you, we can then do more complex things. And so at the end, I provide a script which accesses not only those catalogs, but also the raw imaging and catalog data to, for example, here what we've done is to pick a given object. Okay, so here I'm just selecting an object with a particular ID, but you can put in a query here to select a range of objects or a particular type of object. Find the image in the eye filter and present a figure like this, which shows a postage stamp of the image with the slit orientation overlaid. Be aware the slit orientation here, the astrometry of the background image isn't precisely aligned to the mask design from which the slit position was obtained. So they're not necessarily going to be centered exactly, but it shows you the slit orientation relative to the galaxy. It shows you, sorry, this is a bit obscured in this zoom, but this is signal to noise as a function of magnitude. And it shows where this particular galaxy is relative to the rest of the galaxies in that cluster. So you can see I picked a typical example here with an unusually high signal to noise for its magnitude. The 1D spectrum with error bars, some lines indicated, and the corresponding 2D aligned in wavelength beneath it. So this is a reasonably simple way. Here we have the redshift, the signal to noise, the magnitude, redshift quality. If you just want to quickly look at the image and spectrum of a particular galaxy, this script here will do that for you. Okay, so these are just examples to get you started. So I can go back to the presentation, which is now almost done. Okay, so that's so that I think is something useful we've provided to help make this data as accessible as possible. Remind you again, for more details, you can go to the webpage. This is the paper that has been submitted. It's not on AstroPH yet, but it is available from our webpage. And there's that's certainly essential reading if you want to use the data to any serious extent. So that's all. So I will finish here, and we can now have some discussion. I think there's two sorts of things worth discussing. The most interesting, I think, is to discuss some of the science results. I think some of it is kind of puzzling, and we certainly have not put together a simple explanation that explains all the things that we've just heard about today. And we'd be very keen to hear from some of you about that. But before we go there, I would, having just talked about the data release, I'd be happy to spend 5 or 10 minutes if there are some questions about how to access the data or things related to that before we move on to the science. And I think for this portion, just speak up if you have a question about the data access. Great. So either we've made it really easy to use and intuitive, or you're not interested in the data. Either way, that's good. That's not true. I'm sure questions will come up, and that's fine. Of course, at any time, if you have questions about how to access the data, just email me, and I'm here to help you. One of the things we certainly motivated this survey on was that it would have legacy value for the public and for you. So we want to make it as easy for you to use the data as possible. So just don't hesitate to email me if you have questions about what's there. So let's talk about science, which is more interesting. Greg has prepared a slide to just sort of get us started with the discussion.
All right, let me try and share this. And then see if, do you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay. So I thought I would just kind of summarize 3 of the main results from our submitted or accepted works, and then as a way of just kind of seeding the discussion. But we can obviously talk about other things as well. So on one hand, Lindsay showed us that the star formation rates of galaxies and clusters are slightly suppressed with respect to the field, but not by much. That's up here in the upper left. We heard from Remco this result that the quenched fraction in clusters is significantly higher than the field, but that in contrast to the situation at lower redshift, the shapes of the quiescent galaxy mass functions are identical at very high precision and down to low stellar masses between the clusters and the field. And this is kind of in contrast to the classic environmental quenching that is thought to be mass independent at low redshift. And so if you look at the bottom panel, the bottom right panel, we have the quench fraction excess, again, as Remco and Michael showed, for galaxies and the clusters, and they're elevated both with respect to Z of 0, and they have this mass dependence that shows that anything that's quenching galaxies and clusters at these redshifts is doing so in a way that actually acts more efficiently at high masses. And then we have Christie's result that she presented here in the lower left that shows that the mass weighted ages for the galaxies and clusters imply that they actually formed at a slightly higher redshift than the galaxies in the field, at least for quiescent galaxies. So we've talked about ways in which some kind of accelerated mass quenching might be the main mode of environmental quenching at high redshift. It doesn't look like things are happening in the same mass independent way as at low redshift. And so we thought one way to start the discussion would be to ask what your thoughts are on how to explain these results. If you have anything that pops into your mind, and it's, obviously you're seeing these plots for the first time, many of you, and so it may be hard to come up with something that kind of explains all of them, but some of you may have some results, either published or not, that you want to bring up to the group that may shed some light on some of these items. As we've seen, we're also getting more information from things like Andrew and Jeffrey talked about that aren't quite at the same level of submission or acceptance as these, but I wanted to highlight these for now. So I'm just going to open it up. I just thought it'd be nice to kind of see the discussion this way as opposed to simply asking if there were any questions. But you can also just ask other random things too if you want. And I think the best thing is for people to speak up.
Yeah, if it gets overwhelming, we'll ask for hands up, but I think in the meantime, just speak up.
I have a question related to the cluster selection within GoGreen. So are there concerns that having a combination of red sequence selected clusters and SD selected clusters, could that have something to do with some of these trends that we are seeing in these stellar populations of galaxies, for example?
You know, that's always a possibility. I think what almost all the work has shown at various redshifts is that the dominant thing that matters in a cluster is its mass. So there's pretty strong trends with the mass of a cluster. And if you can get a good handle on that mass, then it doesn't matter a whole lot how it was selected, or if it does matter, it's a second order effect. Now, our sample is not large enough to explore second order effects, so we are the interpretation is based on the assumption that the cluster mass is what matters. The reliability of the cluster mass depends a little bit on the technique. Okay, we have masses from the redshifts. We have dynamical masses. We don't have, for example, X-ray masses for everything in the system. We don't have SZ masses for everything in the system. So having said that, I think mass is the important cluster parameter. We don't necessarily have a great control on what the mass of each individual cluster is. So in that sense, I guess how I'd answer is that my bigger concern is that we don't necessarily have precise mass estimates outside of the dynamics for individual clusters. And because they're selected in different ways, it matters for that reason. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. That's very helpful. Thanks.
And can I ask something, because many people don't have the video on, if you could maybe just say your name when you ask the question, because it's not always obvious who's speaking when if you're looking at it in grid view.
Sorry, Greg, thanks. I'm Gaurav Kuller. I'm a PhD candidate at U Chicago.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much.
Maybe as people are thinking about what they want to say to these questions, there were some specific questions in the chat on Christie's work, in particular on one of the big challenges of getting ages out of this type of SEV fitting are the degeneracies with metallicity and with dust. And this is, of course, something we worried about a lot, and one hopes that we have the data to largely break these degeneracies, but nonetheless, there are still things we don't fully understand about it. I don't know, Christy, if you have a slide prepared, if you want to show the mass metallicity results, because people were asking about that.
Yeah, I do. Greg, I think, okay, no, that worked. I just can't steal the screen sharing from you.
I will gladly relinquish the sharing.
Okay, so we'll just, so this is the plot of the posteriors of the mass-weighted age, not mass-weighted age, sorry, mass metallicity relationship on the right. So this is stellar mass on the x-axis here, stellar metallicity with respect to solar on the y-axis, which is shared between the two plots. And then the dust opacity parameter here on the x-axis on this plot, where this is just a diffuse test screen with the FSPS models that we use. So we're neglecting any sort of dust associated with young stars, just because we're focusing on those quiescent galaxies. So in our fitting procedure, we constrain the prior between metallicity and mass to follow that of the local Galazzi 2005 relationship, which is between these two cyan lines here. But it is just a prior, so there's a penalty for being outside of this region, but if the data strongly prefers that solution, you can still end up with a posterior that's outside of that. So in fact, we do see a number of galaxies which do prefer quite low metallicities, which could drive our ages to older ages. So they prefer earlier formation times. But then that's not true for our entire sample otherwise. I made this plot as well for cluster galaxies independent of field galaxies, and it looks about just the same. So there doesn't seem to be any difference between the environment of the galaxy and this bias from the fitting procedure, if there is one. So it shouldn't affect our main conclusion, but it is something that we talk about quite a bit in the paper. And then just what all these other information is, are different mass metallicities relationships from different papers. So Glasgow 2014 is up here in this blue region, a few different moderate redshift measurements from Cho et al. 2014, and then Morishita 2019, which is a higher redshift sample of just very massive galaxies, but using this star formation history fitting procedure more similar to what we use ourselves.
Thanks, Christy. Since that's up, and again, there were a number of questions about this in the chat. Are there any follow-up questions on that, or has Christy answered your questions?
Yeah, just a quick follow-up here. Joel Roediger with the National Research Council. Christy, the heart of my question was wondering whether you found any differences in the metallicities of field and cluster galaxies.
So no, as far as we can compare things in a given mass range, there doesn't seem to be any strong differences based on the environment.
Thanks.
As Christy has said, the metallicities we get out are pretty strongly dependent on the prior, which is something that we were makes us cautious about interpreting the metallicities directly. I think we use the fact that we don't see a big difference between the cluster and field mass metallicity relationship to justify that the relative age differences we measure are robust, which I think is the main part of the paper. But given the sensitivity of the metallicity to the prior we impose, we don't draw strong conclusions on weak differences in the relationship between cluster and field.
And to add something, I mean, there are works at lower redshift that show gas phase metallicity differences, but we don't actually have gas phase metallicity measurements for our systems because we have not built up near infrared rest frame optical spectroscopy.
Correct.
Yet.
Any other follow-up questions on this? Okay, well, thank you. Maybe I'll ask Greg to put his slide back up again. Sorry to do that back and forth, but.
And there was also some questions about Andrew's work in the chat window as well. I don't know if those got resolved, but here's mine again.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing we've kind of alluded to in our discussions is that indeed we're finding this change potentially in what quenched the galaxies that were already quenched by Z1 compared to what quenched the galaxies that are quenched at lower redshift. And so it might be that results at higher redshift are where we have to go to really understand what's happening. So input on these results from that perspective is also really interesting if people have it.
Hi, Greg. This is Nina Hatch from Nottingham. Hey.
Hey.
So I have a question asking whether you've combined Christie's results on the stellar age and the formation with, say, Remco's results on his stellar mass functions and sort of come up with something about comparing the stellar formation age of your galaxies and the assembly time of the galaxies.
I'm going to let Christy and Remco answer that because the short answer, we have looked at it, but I'm going to let them.
Okay, I'll let them.
Yeah.
Maybe first I'd like to precise a little thing that I maybe stepped over a little bit quickly during my talk. So Greg mentioned here accelerated mass quenching, but I think there are two options for this. And one is to have an early formation of galaxies in like future cluster environments. And the other one is to have a higher star formation rate of galaxies like in protocluster environments, because the instantaneous star formation rate drives the quenching rate in this simple model. So maybe this is another area we could explore together with Christie, not just looking at the mass-weighted ages, but also about potential excess and star formation rate in cluster environments, besides the opportunities to look at this in proto-cluster environments, of course.
Right. So as I understand, in your stellar mass work, you're comparing things at the same stellar mass, but from Christie's work, it looks like the cluster galaxies, which are passive, formed earlier, and so their stars formed earlier. And if I assumed that they stopped assembling earlier than the field galaxies would have assembled later. And so you're comparing two different types of galaxies, things that went passive at different masses. No.
But it also depends what their final mass is, depends on how quickly they form stars prior to quenching. So
yeah,
it is tricky to know whether or not the things that quenched in the field and the things that quenched, how you compare. Do you compare the same mass? Do you try and compare things that evolved into different masses?
I was wondering whether that's the thing, to sort of combine the mass functions with the ages, whether that would help you somehow.
I think we haven't done exactly that, but my feeling from the qualitative nature of the results is that the age difference Christie measures is quite small. So I was actually sort of surprised to see how small it was. And given how small that is, it's my thought is that you're not going to get a very, very big difference, for example, in how much more massive the galaxies kind of grown in that time. Same as what Christie did show is that if we try to come up with a single delayed formation time or accelerated formation time that both reproduces the high quenched fraction that Remco sees and the small age difference that Christie sees, we can't find a simple model to do that. So in other words, if the only thing we have to play with is a time difference between those two populations, we can't seem to reconcile all the results. And I think, and what drives that is the fact that the age difference Christie sees is actually quite small.
Whereas you would need a bigger effect to explain the higher quench fraction that you see in the clusters.
Right.
So reconciling those has been challenging.
And we can do things like, Remco was saying, right? So maybe there's something that happens in protoclusters, accelerated star formation rates or enhanced merging or something that gives rise to more quenched galaxies. What I found most surprising about this, and still sort of puzzles me, is if you just look at the precision on Remco's stellar mass function there on the right-hand side, the shapes match over a very, very broad range in stellar mass. And so, I can think of reasons why the most massive galaxies, for example, in protoclusters, might evolve differently. But when you think about what protoclusters are, when galaxies are spread over huge volumes of the universe before they assemble into clusters at later times, we somehow need those galaxies that aren't just in the core of the protocluster over several orders of magnitude in stellar mass to somehow quench exactly the same way that field galaxies do, at least in the way that their stellar mass function ends up looking the same as the field, but just more often in that protocluster environment. I have a really hard time imagining what can do that.
And if they started too early, and that was the answer, then it's surprising that you find such a small difference in the ages, right? So just saying they all got a head start doesn't work.
Right.
I guess I'll also mention that I'm in the toy models I'm looking at, I'll also be estimating like mass-weighted age differences and comparing to Christie and Remco's work. So maybe I'll have a few more insights.
Right, because that should fold into that as well, right? If there's there's the average formation time, I'm just sort of repeating what Andrew said, but the average formation time of a massive cluster is different from that of a group. And so that's another way to get, if there's just something as simple as a delay time that depends on the mass of the parent halo, you should see that not only in comparing the clusters in the field, but the massive clusters to the groups. But I think the short answer to your question, Nina, was that no, we haven't done exactly
no, that's fine.
population.
It's really, really confusing. I can't see how you get these results. And I think the ages and the stellar mass functions really don't match up. I would have expected Christie to find a much bigger difference.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, maybe to turn it a different way, this makes very strong predictions of what protoclusters should look like. They should be loaded with massive, pretty evolved galaxies at very early times. Are you okay with that, Nina? Are we allowed to do that?
Define very early times. Redshift 5 or Redshift 2?
Based on her ages, what is it, Christy? Redshift 3? 5?
So the mass weighted ages tend to pile up around Redshift 6, which is a bit earlier than some other studies, but that our results would indicate that at least the cluster galaxies, lots of different mass scales start forming or have built the majority of their mass by Redshift 6.
That's different than saying that they're quenched. That just says that they're massive. They may quench at later redshift, right? So.
Right.
Hold on, are you saying they're massive or that the stars have formed and they're passive? Because they don't necessarily mean to have assembled by that redshift.
Yeah, so I guess it's formed, but there's so little time that presumably most of that star formation must have happened in situ, unless they all go off and very coordinate rapid mergers, which I guess isn't impossible, but seems hard to me.
Well, in the cores of the protoclusters, I could see some elevated merging rate, but again, these things are distributed in this filamentary structure, and so whether or not there's huge amounts of merging going on in there, I don't know.
So that's what I want to ask, Nina. Are you cool if we just have these protoclusters loaded with evolved, quenched galaxies at high redshift? Are you going to allow us to do that, or do we have to fill them with star-forming things?
Well, you can. Oh God. You can have them, but your massive galaxies are distributed over really wide areas, really wide volumes. And so you've got to somehow get your massive things into the center very quickly and not the star forming things. So maybe that's possible. If the massive things are in groups, the groups will naturally move in quicker than the things in the filaments. But I don't know. I think this should be given out to the rest of this group, because I could see lots of people who work on protoclusters on this call. So I would like somebody else to come in and answer that question, because I really don't know.
Yeah, I was looking. I think some of those people have. It's late in Europe. They might be gone, but I hear you.
I mean, that is the reason why we're having, so Wednesday is this protocluster symposium. This is unfortunately closed to the broader public, but we do have Nina and others working in that field to talk with us here in Go Green specifically about that question. That's what Wednesday is devoted to. Happy to hear that here as well, but I just wanted to let everybody else in know that that's one of the big questions we'd like to talk about.
And we're also still trying to figure out what Jeffrey's results. I mean, Jeffrey had some interesting results about shape distributions, and that may tell us something about the quenching mechanism as well.
And I had a question about that. Sorry, it's Nina again. I'll be quiet soon. But are you finding S0 galaxies? Is that what the result kind of suggests? That you're finding things that are disk-like and passive being formed in the clusters?
I'm just going to wait for Jeffrey to play.
Jeffrey, you want to?
Sorry, I'm muted. Yeah, I would say it's hard to say because I only like all I can say is that they are more of late compared to the others. With the rest of the population, just judging from the access ratio distribution. But I have also looked into the SERSIC index and also the sigma ones and all the other structural parameter indicators. They do show, for example, they do show a difference in also the SERSIC index, but not in the way that like in local S0s or something. They are more like intermediates, surface index like 2 or like 3-ish, but we do see a little bit excess in like, you know, more on the disky size, like lower surface index, if that answers your questions. But of course, I didn't really look into whether they are S0 lights in the images or, you know, visual morphologies.
I would imagine it would be impossible even in the HST to tell
They
they are S0s, but it was just very interesting, a result that suggested that they were diskier, and that's, we know the passive population at low redshift, it's those disky things that are growing rather than the truly elliptical galaxies.
Right.
And there's also something that, you know, when we look at our results, we've been thinking it in terms of either you have this environmental quenching mode that's the same that works at low redshift. That doesn't work. Or we try something, you know, these kind of accelerated mass quenching or accelerated star, like boosted star formation rate models that Remco just mentioned. Those don't seem to work either. We haven't explored as much hybrid models because these toy models start getting overly complicated then. But we know, you know, Lindsay's shown that the star forming galaxies are at least modestly suppressed. And Jeffrey's shown that the axis ratio distributions are different. So there may actually be environmental quenching and the mass independent mode going on. And then there's this other population that quenched a much more distant past. And I don't think we've explored those kind of models that combine those two scenarios as much. Again, just because they just start getting much more complicated.
I think that's a good point. I think, you know,
yeah. Sorry, Michael.
Sorry, you go ahead, Remco.
The point you made, and that's really hard to imagine then, that such a hybrid model would give you exactly the same shape of the stellar mass function in quiescent galaxies. It needs to be sort of a cosmic, to say that?
Conspiracy?
Conspiracy to yield exactly that stellar mass function.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Although, but, you know, so what I was going to say, we just argued against that a little bit, and that, you know, so the stellar mass function, we are looking on a log scale, and the sort of differences that Jeffrey is seeing and that Lindsay's seeing are pretty subtle effects at the sort of 20-ish% level. So you know, maybe what we're seeing here is, unlike at low redshift, you know, your mass functions tell us the dominant thing is this mass quenching, and there's maybe room for a more subtle environmental effect, which is what you see when you look at a subpopulation like the star-forming galaxies and you look in detail at their star formation rate distributions. Whereas at low redshift, it seems to be, you know, the dominant thing is this accretion-based quenching, which manifests itself in the mass functions as well as everything you look at. So just to say, you know, quantitatively, you know, I'm not yet positive that we can't reconcile those constant shapes of the stellar mass function with the other things we've been talking about.
Hi, this is Lisa from Johns Hopkins. So this is very interesting because in our work, we don't look at star formation of the cluster galaxies at these redshifts, just at their morphology. And in at least 2 of the clusters, we do find a very strong fraction of compact low mass galaxies. And the way we explained it is those compact low mass galaxies might not be quenched yet, so you don't see mass quenching in Go Green, but perhaps they're something, they've already been morphologically transformed, so they will quench in the next few gigayears to reproduce what we see at low redshifts. So I'd be interested to see if in your analysis, where you can split between star-forming and quiescent galaxies, you see a morphology difference in star-forming low mass. And by low mass, I mean anything below log m of 10.5. So not really low mass, but an intermediate mass range.
Thanks. Yeah. Jeffrey, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, so I like the mass range I was using is a 9, like below is from 9.5 to, yeah, like lowest that I go is 9.5. At least for the axis ratio distribution, there doesn't seem to be significant difference between the cluster and the field. For sigma 1 and for Cersei index, maybe they're only for the quiescent galaxies show a difference, but I don't really see any significant difference in the star forming population. Were you referring to the star forming population? Sorry.
Yeah, I was just more interested in the star forming population in case these low mass galaxies are being transformed but are not yet quenched, unlike the high mass galaxies for some reason. We also found a lot of cluster-cluster variations, so that's something that could be interesting to look at instead of aggregate cluster properties.
Right. Yeah, I don't recall seeing significant difference between that couple parameters. But yeah, it will be interesting to see if there's some variation between the clusters.
Out of curiosity, which kinds of cluster variation did you see?
So we have a much less homogeneous sample where we study 2 ISCS clusters, an IDCS and the MAT cows. So it's only 4 clusters. And in 2 of them, we found a very significant, like an over 3 sigma morphology density signal for all galaxies, including low mass. And then the other 2, they're basically consistent with the field. And I think someone mentioned before that this is a strong function of cluster mass. So the IDCS one, although is at redshift 1.8, is extremely massive for that redshift. So mass would be a very interesting thing to look at if you guys ever get.
Well, I think mass can't be the only driver of the variation. I mean, we see this at slightly higher redshift. Where if you look at Z at 1.6 clusters, and just look at the quench fraction, there's a huge range in quench fractions, where even some low mass things like the 1.62 protocluster in the UDS has a very quenched core, but it's not massive at all. So, these things have very different accretion histories, and that may not depend on their mass. I mean, it does, but they just have, even at a fixed mass, a huge range in accretion histories.
Yeah, and it's one place where actually Go Green can have a bit of difficulty because we deliberately chose the sample to span a wide range in halo mass so that we could look for halo mass dependence. And that means at fixed halo mass we only have a small sample, so it's difficult to look for trends in scatter or variation between clusters at fixed mass because the sample's not large enough. But we do. But I think there are signs. I mean, even in Andrew's plots, for example, show signs that when the subsamples start getting small at a fixed halo mass, results on quench fraction and things start to jump around a little bit, which could be a sign that that there is substantial scatter. I'm sure there is substantial scatter. It'd be a bit hard for us to constrain.
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Please.
Maybe a little bit stupid question, I don't know. I'm Mustafa from Turkey, and I'm not working on this cluster galaxies, so maybe it's a little bit stupid question, sorry for that. You are always considering quenching is going, from active to passive, but what about the other side, the reverse? So because I know some rejuvenating galaxies, like, they were passive, then they are now becoming active again. So what if they are already quenched and then they started to, form stars again, and we're seeing this kind of anomaly? Is it possible in clusters? I don't know. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think the two things I would say. One is that, and I think we talked about this a little bit on the chat, but so Karen McNabb, who's talking tomorrow, is looking in some detail at the galaxies in the Green Valley between the blue and the red sequence. And if things are sort of moving back and forth between the blue sequence getting rejuvenated, then they should have some presence in there. The other thing is that if they so right now we haven't done the modeling for the star forming population because that's much more difficult. If there are things that are going back and forth, so we're having bursts of star formation, but then going back to the quiescent sequence, I think that would cause them to end up having relatively young mass-weighted ages. So again, when we look at Christie's result and we see a handful of galaxies at young ages towards the right of the plot, those are plausibly things that had you know, a little bit of rejuvenated star formation. Either they're on their way to the Green Valley or their way back from it. But there's not a lot of them. The majority of them have pretty ancient-looking populations. But if I understand your question, I think, you know, we haven't yet done the analysis on the star-forming population to know how many of those might have been recently quiescent.
I understand. Thank you. I have another question, if I may. The field galaxies, how do you define them? Because I know it's really hard to, you know, put lines between group clusters and field and, you know, group galaxies or void galaxies. So how do you define the field galaxies?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think, and it's actually quite germane to a lot of this discussion. We haven't actually talked about it, but so by field we just mean everything. Okay, so it's not isolated, it's not central galaxies, it's the average population, it's everything. And so in all these comparisons, we're comparing galaxies in dense environments with the average. I think, you know, one thing that is very likely true is that when you look at the overall field, and in particular, if you look at massive quenched galaxies, most of those things are probably in groups, even at high redshifts. And I don't know what the fraction is, but it's not clear, you know, when you're looking at low mass star-forming galaxies in the field, that's probably sampling a different average environment than high mass quenched galaxies in the field. And that might go some way to explaining some of these differences we see, in that what we're looking at in the field, again, looking at massive quiescent galaxies, you're predominantly looking at groups, let's say, rather than isolated galaxies. What one would really like to do, what I would really like to do, Andrew talked about this central versus satellite distinction. You'd like to be able to identify central galaxies and satellite galaxies and divide them that way. But then you need a very highly complete spectroscopic sample, and GoGreen's not designed for that. I think that's an excellent point.
Well, okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Maybe another thing that's related to this question also is that the field galaxies that we study here are of course from the cluster fields. So they may be, because clusters and groups cluster on scales of several tens of megaparsecs. So you may have a higher number of groups that may have collapsed along with the cluster, or at least early in the universe. And that may give you not exactly the same field sample that are in front and the back of the clusters as a separate field sample at the same redshifts. I haven't quantified this, but something we could look at.
Well, that is we're at 2 o'clock here in Waterloo. I think that was actually quite good discussion. Thank you for your thoughts. Happy for any of you to follow up at any time if you have other thoughts or want to know more information, to